video is kindly sponsored by Skillshare. Check out the link in the video description to get your 2-month free trial.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ali. I'm a junior doctor working in Cambridge, and in this video, we're taking a look at Apple's lineup of iPads. So I'll be comparing the budget iPad, the iPad mini, the iPad Air, and the 11-inch iPad Pro, and I'll be sharing my thoughts about which iPad I would recommend for which sorts of people. As usual, I'm going to start off with a conclusion, so if you want to save a bit of time and that's all you're here for, that's fine. But then for the rest of the video, I'm going to be explaining the reasons, the rationale behind that conclusion, and I'll be doing that in 4 parts. Firstly, I'll be talking about why people use an iPad at all, like what the point of an iPad is. Secondly, I'll be talking about diminishing returns, and I'll be valuing each of the 4 iPads at different price points. Thirdly, I'll be talking about the value of delight and how that feeds into the purchase of an iPad. And finally, I'll be talking about the rationale behind purchasing an iPad Pro. As usual, timestamps are going to be linked in the video description and in a pinned comment, so feel free to skip around the video if you feel like it. But now, let's just jump into it. So in summary, the iPad that I would recommend depends on what you're going to be using it for. So if you're going to be using the iPad as exclusively a consumption device to consume content like Netflix, YouTube, web browsing and stuff, I personally recommend the iPad mini, although if you want a bigger screen, the budget iPad is pretty solid as well. If, however, you want to do some kind of creation work on an iPad, maybe you're a student and you want to use the Apple Pencil, I'd personally recommend the $489 iPad Air. And finally, if you have professional powerful needs like maybe video editing or dense photo editing, or you're desperate for USB-C, or you just have a ton of spare cash to burn, then the iPad Pro is the one for you. So that was the upfront conclusion. If that's all you're here for, then that's absolutely fine. Please do drop a like on the video and consider subscribing on your way out. But for the rest of this video, I'm going to be expanding on those conclusions in a lot more detail. I'm going to be explaining why I think those 3 iPads belong with those 3 different sorts of people. So the way I see it, everyone uses an iPad in a slightly different way, but it can essentially be plotted on a spectrum from consumption on the one hand to creation on the other hand. So if you're in the consumption camp, that's things like YouTube, Netflix, web browsing, maybe reading books using the Kindle app or iBooks, things like that. That is the consumption category. And all the way on the other side, we've got the creation spectrum. And right on the extreme end of that spectrum is things like video editing, photo editing, music production, you know, the pro applications of an iPad. And then kind of further towards the middle is things like writing using a keyboard, taking notes using an Apple Pencil, maybe replying to emails. And the way I see it is that the closer to the creation pro end of the spectrum you personally are, the more money I would recommend spending on an iPad. So in the conclusion, I said that if you're purely in the consumption camp for your iPad use, then I would personally recommend the iPad mini. And the reason I recommend the iPad mini over, for example, the budget iPad or the iPad Air, is that the mini you can hold in one hand. And the one-handed use of the mini is an absolutely incredible thing, because let's say you are commuting, it's very feasible to hold the iPad in one hand. It's small enough that you can pretty much take it wherever you want without having to worry about it. So that's why I would go for the iPad mini personally, and I've got a more detailed review of the iPad mini coming a little bit later on. Now, let's say you're further along that spectrum of consumption and creation. Let's say you're a student and you're using the iPad to take handwritten notes, or you're typing up stuff. I would personally go for the iPad Air in those circumstances, the $489 iPad Air. Although you can get by with an iPad mini, the screen is just too small to really do anything meaningful on it. And if you're in the creation camp and you want to, for example, take notes with your iPad, chances are you're going to be taking those on a Surface. So there's not really much of a difference between writing on an iPad mini in terms of space and writing on an iPad Air, but it is a massive difference in terms of the size of the paper and how it feels like to take notes. Like, I tried using the iPad mini to plan some of these videos and it is doable, but I wouldn't want to do it all the time. Whereas the iPad Air is an absolute joy to use when using it for handwritten notes. So then this becomes a toss-up. That do we go for the iPad Air with this possibly weird keyboard attachment, or do we go for the iPad budget? And there is a £180 difference between these 2 devices. And what I'm going to argue is that I would recommend you go for the iPad Air. And that takes us to part 2 of the video, where we talk about diminishing returns. Okay, so whenever we're buying anything in life, I think we definitely want to keep diminishing returns in the back of our minds. And that's the idea that spending more money on this thing does not necessarily lead to an equal gain in benefit and equal gain in output. So when it applies to iPad purchasing decisions, I think the graph looks something like this. And let's assume that the iPad Pro is the gold standard. So at a cost of, let's say, about £770, because that's the most basic version you can get, let's put that at 100%. Where do the other iPads stack on this graph? So we have the £319 budget iPad, and I would personally put that at about 91%. Now let's talk about the iPad mini. The iPad mini is $399. I don't really think it fits on this graph personally, but if I had to, I'd probably put its value at, let's say, 92%. The iPad Air is about £479 or $479, and I would set that at around about 95% or thereabouts. And so the graph of cost versus benefit we get looks something like this. And this is the perfect illustration of diminishing returns. You get to a point where the more money you spend on iPad, it gives you very marginal improvements in value, improvements in quality of life. Now, the reason I'm showing this graph is not just to be pretentious, although that is admittedly quite a big part of it, but it's because I think it's really important to understand that the budget iPad is very marginally less good than the iPad Air, and the iPad Air is only very marginally less good than the iPad Pro. So if you are going to be spending the extra £180 difference between the iPad budget and the iPad Air, or thereabouts, or the extra £450 difference between the iPad budget and the iPad Pro, you really want to understand exactly why you're spending that money. So at the start, you might remember that I said the iPad Air is the one that I would recommend for most people. And the reason I said that is because I think this £180 price jump between the iPad budget and the iPad Air is worth it, whereas I don't think the £450 jump between the budget and the Pro is worth it. So what are those differences between the iPad budget and the iPad Air that make the iPad Air worth the £180 upgrade? There's three things basically. Firstly is the screen quality. Secondly is the keyboard attachment possibilities. And thirdly is the amount of power that you get. And let's talk about these in turn. So firstly, the screen. This has a very nice glass screen, whereas the iPad budget has a not very nice plasticky screen. Like, the iPad budget is an absolutely incredible device, and it's amazing that you can get something as good as this for £319, but the display does genuinely feel like a piece of plastic. And so if budget is really an issue for you, then this is absolutely fine. Like, it's not a big deal, but I think the difference between glass and plastic is sort of significant in my opinion. There is a very slight difference in Apple Pencil writing capabilities. This iPad budget has a little bit more of a gap between the screen and the internal bit of the iPad, so there is a very slight lag with the Apple Pencil, but it's something that you don't really notice unless you put them side by side. The iPad Air is absolutely incredible. It's an identical writing experience to the iPad Pro. And it genuinely does feel like you're writing directly onto the screen. But again, the experience is kind of similar. It's just if you have these side by side, the budget iPad is very slightly worse. By the way, if you're a student and you're going to be using the iPad for anything that involves the Apple Pencil, I'd highly recommend you get the paper-like screen protector for it. This is something I've been using for the last year plus, and I'm so used to writing on it, like it does feel like paper when I'm writing on it, that when I bought these new iPads to review and I had to test the Apple Pencil out on them, it just felt so weird writing on glass, like to the point that I think there's only a bit of difference between the budget iPad and the iPad Air in terms of the screen, but there is a world of difference between writing with a paper-like screen protector and writing on a glass screen. So if you're interested in getting the paper-like, I'll put an affiliate link in the description below. So if you buy it using that link, then I make about enough money for a cup of coffee, so you can help support the channel along with my caffeine addiction if you want to get it. It's sick. Paper-like screen protector, paperlike.com. Check it out. Secondly, the iPad Air allows you to use things like Apple's smart keyboard connector, which lets you attach this origami keyboard to your iPad Air, which means you can then semi-easily turn it into almost a laptop replacement where you've got a keyboard. It's quite a nice keyboard. I quite like the experience of typing on it. You can turn it into this a lot more easier. Whereas with the iPad budget, you don't have that option. If you want to attach a keyboard to this, you have to go for a third-party Bluetooth option. So for example, this is the Logitech Slim Pro case or something like that, and iPad goes in and like sticks here, and then you can like attach it, I think, like this. So then it folds into this sort of package. It's kind of heavy, it's not that nice, but I mean, it does the job. And this thing I think was about £70, whereas the official Apple one is about £150. So if you really are on a budget and you need an iPad and you want to be able to type on the iPad, then this does work. It's just a bit less nice than using the official Apple kind of first-party product. And finally, in terms of power, the iPad Air has the newest processors. It's got a higher Geekbench benchmark scores. Essentially what that means is that if you get the iPad Air, it'll probably last you longer than the budget iPad. So those are the three main differences: screen, keyboard, and power. And in my opinion, those differences are worth the £180. But to explore this in a bit more detail, we're going to go into part 3 of the video where we talk about the value of delight. So by this point in the video, I've been arguing that the iPad Air is the one that I'd recommend for most people, including most students. The iPad budget pretty much does the same thing, and you probably won't notice much of a difference, but it's enough of a difference that it justifies the £180 price tag. And the reason behind that is because of the delight factor that comes with the iPad Air and with the iPad Pro. And what I mean by that is that although you can do the same stuff, the iPad Air is just a little bit nicer to use. It's a little bit more delightful. It makes me want to use this. And I think the very fact that it makes me want to use it is what justifies the £180 investment. Now, there's 2 main reasons behind this. The first one is that it's a generally peddled piece of financial advice that you want to be spending your money where you spend your time. So people often say that you should invest in a good bed and you should invest in good pairs of shoes because you are spending literally 8 hours of your life every single day in your bed and with your shoes. Therefore, any extra money, any extra value that you get out of those things is going to be exacerbated over the long term. And this is a concept that my brother likes to refer to as measure, and we talk about that in one of our podcast episodes at Not Overthinking. That's our new podcast. I'll put a link below if you want to hear us talk about this concept for about 50 minutes on end. But there's a second part of it, and that is something that I've heard less often on the internet. And that's the idea that I think we want to be spending our money where we want to be spending our time. So what do I mean by this? I mean that let's say I were to buy a new sofa. That would encourage me to spend more time on the sofa because then my sofa is more comfortable. That sofa in the background is not very comfortable. Therefore, I don't spend a lot of time there. But do I really want to be spending more time on the sofa? Probably not. Let's say I wanted to buy myself a Tesla. I wanted to club together all my YouTube earnings for the last 3 years and whatever and decide to buy a Tesla for myself. That would encourage me to spend more time in the car, more time driving. Is that really what I want to be doing with my life? Do I want to be spending more time driving? No, I don't. Let's say I were to buy a TV for the house. We don't have a TV at the moment. If we do Game of Thrones nights, we have to watch it on the monitor. But all that's going to do is it's going to encourage me and my housemate and our friends to spend more time watching TV, which is again not something we want to be doing. And I mention all this because spending £180 to upgrade from the budget iPad to the iPad Air now, I think that is something you do want to be doing. So for me, when I was a student and even now when I'm a doctor, any time I spend on my iPad is time that is inherently productive because of the things that I do on the iPad. I used to use the iPad for taking notes in lectures. I used to have all my textbooks on it. I used to have my past paper questions. I used to have medical books on it. So if I was spending time on the iPad, it would be productive. I'd be learning stuff. And I think if you're the sort of person who does use the iPad for productive, for creative purposes, then the fact that this extra investment in the iPad Air is a bit more of a delight to use will encourage you to use it more. And therefore it becomes an investment in your life that adds more value over time rather than just a liability. So I've done a whole video on the iPad Pro, so I don't really want to spend too much time talking about it. But if you follow the logic about the value of delight and stuff, you might think that, okay, well, I've rated the iPad Pro as 100%, I've rated the iPad Air as only 95%. Surely that 5% increase in value is worth the £300 extra investment between the iPad Pro and the iPad Air. And I would argue that that really depends on your budget. I think this £180 difference, $180 difference, again, it does depend on your budget, but clubbing together an extra $180 is probably more doable for a lot of people than clubbing together an extra £300-400 for the iPad Pro. Yes, the iPad Pro is a slight increase in quality of life compared to the iPad Air, but unless you have a lot of money to spare, I don't think that difference justifies the £300. The experience of writing with the iPad with the Apple Pencil is identical. The screen is pretty much identical. The only real difference is the fact that you can magnetically stick this on, which is nice. It's really nice to have, but probably not worth £300. This keyboard thing costs another £200. This is slightly nicer than the old one because you don't have to fold it around in the origami fashion. But again, probably not worth the extra money you spend on the iPad Pro. Thirdly, in terms of power, this has the X chip, this has a normal chip. I can't even remember what they're called because the power doesn't really matter to me. In terms of power, yeah, if you're a pro user and you need the iPad Pro for graphic editing or video editing or music production, stuff like that, then yeah, of course, you want the extra power, you want the best thing out there. But you probably already know that. You don't need me to tell you this over video. If you have some kind of budget, I think the iPad Air is the sweet spot between price and value, whereas the iPad Pro is amazing. I absolutely love the iPad Pro. I use it every single day. But for me, it's slightly different. Like I work full time as a doctor. I've got a side income on YouTube. I've got my side business that generates money on the side. I pretty much exclusively use this for business purposes, so it's a tax deductible expense. There are a lot of factors for me that mean that I would go for the iPad Pro, but that's not a recommendation that I can, with any good conscience, pass along to other students. Please get the iPad Air. It's absolutely incredible. I absolutely love this thing. But if you have a ton of cash to burn, then sure, go for the iPad Pro. Before we wrap up, I just want to say a massive thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is the biggest platform for online courses, and I've particularly enjoyed classes about how to edit videos. I've gotten some tips on how to use Final Cut Pro. So for example, this class by Benjamin Holsall was pretty solid. I also recently started to teach myself how to cook. So I watched this Think Like a Chef series, which was rather good and ended up making quite a nice roast dinner from it. Essentially, Skillshare is a fantastic way to learn any skill online. And if you enjoy the way that this video was edited and produced, I'm actually going to be working on my own Skillshare classes where I take a deep dive into exactly how I make these sorts of videos and how I go about filming, editing, post-producing all this stuff. So if you like, you can sign up for a free trial of Skillshare by following the link below. The first 500 people to click the link will get 2 months of Skillshare completely free. And after those 2 months, if you decide that it's worth it, you can continue with a paid subscription. I've personally got a paid subscription. I think it's worth it. You learn a lot of stuff that's produced really well. So thanks again, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video. So let's wrap up this very long and very rambly video. I hope you found it useful. I've hopefully argued that if you are purely a consumer, then the iPad mini is the one for you. I think the one-handedness of the iPad mini beats all of the benefits that a slightly bigger screen would have. And this is only £399. You don't need any extra accessories for it. You don't really need an Apple Pencil for it because all you're doing is watching stuff. That's absolutely fine. If you're a student, then I'd probably recommend the iPad Air. In fact, if you're most people, I'd probably recommend the iPad Air. It's £489. It's really, really, really nice. And if you want it to become more of a laptop replacement, then you can go for the official Apple keyboard thing. It's a nice keyboard. It does turn it into more of a laptop replacement, and I'd probably recommend that for students as well if you can afford the extra £150 for the keyboard. If you're a student, or if you're most people and you're on a budget, then the $319 iPad is absolutely incredible. It's astonishing that you can get an iPad this good for only £319, but it's a very slight, it's got a slightly plasticky screen. It's a bit less powerful. It's a bit harder to attach a keyboard to it. It's probably going to last a bit less long. If you can afford to club out the extra £180 for the iPad Air, then I would recommend that. And finally, if you're a pro user or you just have a ton of spare cash to burn, or you can justify this as a business expense, then the iPad Pro is absolutely incredible. It's the one that I use for literally 10 plus hours every single day. But to be honest, if I didn't have the iPad Pro, I'd be using the iPad Air just as often, and I probably wouldn't really notice much of a difference. So that was a wrap up of which iPad you should buy in 2019. I hope you found this video useful. If you liked the video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, then please consider doing so. You might like to check out a new podcast that me and my brother have started. It's called Not Overthinking. And I think episode 3 of that podcast, or maybe it's episode 4, we talk more about purchasing decisions and why we recommend, for example, investing in a kitchen bin versus investing in a Tesla, for example. So I'll link that below. You might like to listen to that. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.